Hello, everyone. My name is William Schragus. I'm a lecturer at the Culinary Institute of America, and I'm the Chief Sales Officer for Barrel Craft Spirits. And I'm here today to talk to you about food and wine pairing, both from a romantic and enjoyable sense, but also from a chemical sense. Today's objectives are mostly to talk about what makes a good food and wine pairing, what makes something enjoyable for people, what adds value or adds excitement to think about what you're consuming together rather than separately from a decision-making standpoint. The first thing we're going to talk about is the structure and the acidity and the sweetness and the tannin and the intensity of different wines. And by that, I mean what makes a wine different on a case-by-case basis so that you can make better decisions about what food you might have with it. We're going to discuss the basic guidelines for making pairings. There's certain rules that you can break, and there's certain rules you can bend so that you don't put things together that might clash or might be off-putting. We're also going to walk through some of the more classic pairings in history and in the world, where are they from and why they work. And finally, we're going to talk about some of my favorite food and wine pairings in a modern sense, either things that I like to put together at home or things that I make a point to order when I'm at restaurants. So first, let's talk about what it means to pair food and wine. Today, we think about food and wine pairing in a somewhat casual sense, and that's because of the emergence of the sommelier field and wine professionals in general over the last 5 to 10 years. And so we don't necessarily think of food and wine pairing as a very formal thing. However, the history of pairing in food and wine goes way back to wine collection and sort of formal dining and hosting. People would have large wine cellars either to show off the land that they had a vested interest in or owned, or the places they had been. And the access to fine wine was a lot harder to break into than it used to be. And so pairing used to be done mostly just in fine restaurants or in places where people had large collections where they could show off what they have or what they know. When you pair food and wine, what you're doing is you're considering either the food you're eating to help inform the decision about the wine that you're drinking, or you're considering the wine that you're drinking help to inform the decision about the food you're ordering or eating. Because of that, we do wine and food pairing at home pretty much any time that we're having wine or really any other beverage at all. We just don't always realize we're doing it. A good pairing is achieved when the moment or the meal feels more special than it would have had there not been that combination of wine and food. And that can happen for any number of reasons. What I have here is a picture of latkes or potato pancakes, some with smoked salmon on them, and a bottle of Napa Chardonnay. The reason I bring this up is because I remember having a bottle of Napa Chardonnay that I brought back from California when I moved back to New York, and we had it with potato pancakes at my house at home. And though that pairing worked reasonably well, I remember it more because I was excited to show the wine to my parents, and I felt like I was at home because it was a meal that my mother makes specifically at home. So here's some reasons to pair wine. The top one, chemical, is the thing that we're going to talk about most today. And this has to do with making sure that the actual structure of the wine, the acidity, the sugar, the bitterness, the sweetness, match the food in a way that they will complement each other in terms of the way that the molecules actually work on your palate. Equally important, though, is making sure that if you would like it to, there's a cultural connection between the food and the wine, or a situational connection between the food and the wine. So is it a special food and thus it should have a special wine with it? Is it something that's celebratory? And finally, there's wine and food pairings that are sentimental for one reason. There's things that people like to have together. And because of that, it creates a moment that's recreatable or a tradition within you and your friends or the place that you're going. And that's a really reasonable or exciting pairing as well. I learned to think about food and wine pairing at the Culinary Institute of America, actually, from my mentor, Christy Dufault. And she had this very simple scale that she would talk about that she called the -2+2 scale. And what that means is a 0, which is a neutral pairing, means that you're enjoying the wine and you're enjoying the food, but neither one is adding anything to each other or the situation. And there's plenty of situations where that pairing is fine or makes sense because the food is really good and the wine is really good, or it's what you had around, or it makes sense in that moment. A +1, which is a really good food and wine pairing, is a situation where because you picked a certain wine, the food tastes better, or because you picked a certain wine or a certain food, the wine tastes better, but not both at the same time. A +2, which is rarer than you would expect, is when the food and the wine are having effects on each other so that the wine is more enjoyable than it would have been in a vacuum, and the food is more enjoyable than it would have been in a vacuum. And we're going to look at a couple of those that I would call +2, but in thinking about food and wine pairing after this class, the goal is not to always have a quote unquote +2. The goal is to enjoy the situation more, and usually it's to take one of the food or the wine and complement it to the second one. Because that is how most wine pairing really originated, the wine being chosen for the food or a dish being developed because the wine was very special. Same thing goes for the minus side here. If there's a situation where food tastes too bitter or too acidic or flat, meaning you can't taste the flavor, or similarly, the wine tastes too sour or you can taste the alcohol too much, we'd call them a -1 or a -2 if they sort of ruined each other for one reason or another. It's important to try to avoid those things. And like I said at the beginning, where some of the rules can be bent and others can be broken, those rules are usually in place to avoid the minus side of this scale. I'm going to try to show a bunch of pictures here because this is a fun class for me to teach because it's talking about food and wine, which I love, and the combinations that I like. And I want to make sure that we can see some of the beauty in the food and wine while I give examples of things that I really like. This is a Chenin Blanc, which in South Africa is also called Steen. And it is often paired with roast chicken. Roast chicken, and we're going to talk about it later, some of the fattier fishes sit in the middle of this food and wine pairing where they are meat or fish. So you might think you'd pair a red or a white wine with them traditionally, but they're lean enough that you can find flavor combinations on either side that work. Steen or Chenin Blanc from South Africa, it's a very full-bodied white wine. And so it really brings out what is special about a specific roast chicken or the roastiness itself or the herbs or the butter or the sauce that's on it. So let's talk about wine in the context of pairing from a structural standpoint. We're going to talk about sort of 7 different sections here. The first being flavor, second being sweetness, the third being acidity. There's tannin, which is a word that gets thrown around in the wine industry a lot, that I'm going to explain 2 different aspects of tannin, the astringency aspect and the bitterness aspect. We're going to talk about intensity in wine, and then we're going to talk about overall structure in terms of which one of this is most important about each different wine. The most straightforward and first place that people go when they think about food and wine pairing is the flavor of the wine and the flavor of the food itself. And though that is not as structurally important as you might think, you do want to make sure that the actual things you're tasting from a flavor perspective on your taste buds taste good together. So there's really 2 different types of flavor matching. There's what's called congruent pairing. The example here is beef and mushroom, and those are flavors that have a lot in common, and so they often taste good together. And then there's flavor matching that's called complementary pairing, which are flavors that have nothing to do with each other, but they bring very different things to the table, and they complement each other. They don't create off flavors, and so you have a more complete dish or experience when they're together. Here's some examples of congruent flavors. On the right here, we have one of my favorite producers of wine called Pierre Gaillard. They're in the Rhone Valley, which is in eastern France. And they make wine out of a grape called Syrah most of the time in the northern Rhone Valley. Syrah in France is a very savory, some people even say barnyard style wine. It has really earthy notes. It's often much drier than other big red wines from around the world. And because of that, it is often paired with lamb, which is a gamier style of meat. Lamb has a lot of fat, so it still needs a big red wine, and we'll talk about that later. But if you want to have a congruent pairing where that earthiness or that gaminess is highlighted because it's something you like about the wine and something you like about the food, these 2 dishes often, this wine and this dish often go well together. Similarly, and this is one of my favorites, on the left here, we have what I call a composed salad. So it's a tomato salad with feta. It has a couple different types of greens in it. It has barbecued or roasted or grilled shrimp. And so there's going to be sweetness. There's going to be a little bit of creaminess from the feta. There's going to be some spice from, I see black pepper there. There's definitely going to be a good amount of acidity from the dressing. There's going to be a little bit of that sort of fishiness from the shrimp and some sweetness from the shrimp as well. On the right here, we have a American or a Napa Valley Sauvignon Blanc, which is a reasonably full-bodied white wine, but it is one that is often very zesty and fresh tasting. They use a little bit of oak and a little bit of stainless steel to ferment this, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Because of that, there's a really wonderful variety of flavors within Napa Sauv Blanc, especially Arkenstone. And so when you have a composed salad like this that has a lot going on and is really flavorful and loud, but doesn't want to be overwhelmed, some of these fuller-bodied white wines work really well for it. Complementary flavors, as we said before, are situations where you have wine and food that are bringing very different things to the table. I guess pun intended in that sense. A good example here would be Riesling, which I think all of us think of as a very sweet wine. But when you're talking about the flavor of wine, I'm not really talking about the sweetness in terms of sugar levels. I'm talking about the types of flavors that are there. Riesling is a wine that can be very sweet in terms of sugar levels, but it can also be very dry or have very little sweetness to it. When you have a pickle board like this, there are so many different things going on. The only thing you really see in common from a flavor profile here is that everything is very tart, but some things are spicy, some things are sweet. And so in order to match with everything and also bring together a sort of delicious, easy pairing, using Riesling with pickle boards with things that have sweet things and spicy things, with things that have different types of sort of bright vegetables, it brings a sweetness to the entire situation. And so it allows you to sort of pair with more variety of things. Similarly, on this board, you have some specific things that are very difficult to pair with. I think red beets would be a good example. And I'm trying to think of asparagus there would be a good example. There's some garlic there that's sometimes difficult to pair with. And so it's important to pick a wine that is generally food friendly altogether when you have something like a pickle board or something that has a very big variety of flavors. And Riesling is one of the easiest go-tos for pairing in that type of situation. Finally, we have jamón ibérico, which is a really famous style of cured pork coming from Spain. With it, I paired here Camins de Priorat from the Priorat region of Spain. It's a very inky, very grapey, very full-bodied style of wine. That sweetness complements the acorny and nutty flavor of jamón ibérico really well. And so it's a really classic pairing from a flavor standpoint, even though you could go very full or very light-bodied wine with something as flavorful as jamón ibérico. A lot of wine pairing comes down to how the food is going to be perceived once you have it with the wine or you're consuming them together. And to predict how a wine will act, the easiest way to predict how a wine will act when working with a food is to know the structural levels of the sweetness, the acidity, the astringency, the bitterness, and also the intensity of the wine in general. Here's the way that different aspects of wine generally work with each other. And if you look at the blue lines here, those are lines that things dissipate each other or complement each other well. So if you have a very fatty food or a very salty food, you see salt and fat sort of help each other out. So a lot of fatty foods are also very salty. They tend to work well with very acidic wines and or very sweet wines. Similarly, fat and salt dissipate the bitterness in wines quite a bit. Spicy food, however, does not necessarily work well with bitter wines or acidic wines because they're additive. If something is both very acidic and very spicy, you're going to notice the spiciness and the acidity much more. It's not that you have to avoid those necessarily, but you have to think about them exacerbating each other rather than complementing each other. So let's talk first about sweetness in wine. And I know that I mentioned this briefly before, but there is a common misconception in the wine world that fruity and sweet wine means the same thing. A fruit-forward wine has to do with the flavor profile, things that taste like sweet fruits. It doesn't have to do with the sugar level or the residual sugar in the wine itself. And when we talk about dry wine, what we're talking about is not necessarily wine that is astringent or drying on our palate. It's wine that has less sugar in it. There are quite a few wines that we think of as dry wine that actually do have a small amount of residual sugar in them. And that helps with wine pairing quite a bit and helps with the body of the wine. When you are pairing wine with food, and this is one of the rules that is good to stay to as often as you can, you always want the wine to be as sweet or sweeter than the food. So when you're thinking about really traditional old world foods that don't have any sugar in them, don't have fresh fruits in them, don't have some of the vegetables that have some sugar in them like tomatoes, it's easier to pair them with very dry wines. When you start bringing in sweeter foods, you want to start looking for wines that have a little bit of residual sugar in them. Though this doesn't cover every wine, there's two charts here. And this has to do with, these charts list some grapes and generally how much sugar is left in them when we're making wine, or how dry or sweet they are. So I want to bring everyone's attention here to the middle, this off-dry section. These are wines that a lot of people think of as sweet wines, but they actually are wines that are designed for savory dishes. They're designed for savory dishes that have some residual sugar in them. And so I don't want to push anyone towards wines that have some sugar in them if that's not something you enjoy, but it is something that is interesting to think about when you're talking about wine and food pairing, because sometimes you need that sugar to match the food. And those pairings in fine dining often taste really good. And the reason that people enjoy them is because a wine they might not have been picked was presented with the food. Here's the same chart talking about red wines. And I'd like to bring everyone's attention here to this grape Sangiovese that we're going to talk about later, which is dry, but not bone dry. Bone dry is a term that people use for like almost no residual sugar in it at all. So as a case study talking about sweetness in wine and wine pairing, I want to talk about duck, specifically roasted duck. Duck is obviously a delicious food. It has a lot of really sweet, delicious fat in it under the skin. And the way that most people like to prepare duck is to roast it in a way where the fat gets caramelized or gets a Maillard reaction. And so you have a sweetness and a crispiness on the outside, but there's still a lot of sweet, delicious, flavorful fat available in the duck. One of the most classic pairings for roasted duck is a wine called Beaujolais, which is made in the most southern part of Burgundy out of a grape called Gamay, which is very grapey in its flavor. And I know saying a grape is grapey seems a little ridiculous, but my point here is that there are some wines that don't taste like the grapes they come from because of the way that they're fermented. Gamay tastes a lot like the way that we think of table grapes as well. So it has a very sweet flavor, but it's not a wine that has a lot of residual sugar in it. Whereas the famous duck preparation, Peking duck, is served with a sauce called hoisin sauce, which has sugar in it. And so we like to pair wines with Peking duck that actually have some residual sugar in them. And that is why off-dry or medium sweet, so still designed for savory dishes, but dishes that have some sweetness in them, we often see off-dry Rieslings paired with Peking duck in America. So even though the duck itself is a little bit different, because of the preparation and the sauce, we pick different sweetness levels with the wine that we're going to put with it. Here's a picture of roast duck. It's making me hungry looking at this. And here's a picture of Peking duck and the hoisin sauce right here. The second thing we consider when we're talking about food and wine pairing is acidity. And it is difficult to judge the acidity of a wine from tasting it, because a lot of really wonderful wines have very elevated acidity, but that acidity is integrated into the flavor of the wine or neutralized by small amounts of residual sugar in the wine. There's two very different but sort of main types of acid that exist in wine, and they both contribute to acidity, but they taste very different to us. The first is the acid that's naturally present in grapes, which is called malic acid, and that's the type of acid that's also found in green apples. The second is lactic acid, which exists in wine through a process called malolactic fermentation, under which the lactic acid is malic acid is converted into lactic acid. So you lose some of those bright green apple-y flavors, and what you get is a creamier flavor. It might seem less tart, but it still has an amount of acidity in it. In general, like sweetness, it is always good for the wine to be as acidic or more acidic than the food. And wine is reasonably acidic anyway, so this doesn't come into play that often. But when you are looking at very acidic foods, when you're looking at salads that have vinaigrettes on them, and we'll talk about oysters a little bit later, you end up having to limit yourself to wines that have an elevated amount of acidity so they can carry themselves through the food rather than sort of dying with it or tasting just very sour. Even though it is difficult to taste acid levels with wine, there are some ways that you can predict acid levels. In general, wines from colder areas are more acidic. And that's because there's two types of ripeness in grape. There's the ripeness that you get from sun exposure, which can happen in cold areas. There's the type of ripeness you get from heat exposure, which happens in warmer areas or areas that have less cloud cover or different relationships to bodies of water. The heat exposure will make grapes get less acidic as they are ripening, whereas the sun exposure may not. And so there's some parts of the world like Austria that make extremely high acid wines because they're cold, but they do get enough sun exposure for those wines to still be very ripe tasting. Also, in general, wines from what we call the old world, so the classic European wine producing countries, Italy, Spain, France, Greece, some people would also consider Germany and Austria, Switzerland, and then in some cases, the Middle East as well. They generally have higher acid in their wine, and that's due to the weather there, but it's also due to the winemaking techniques and sort of what people are looking for in the wines there. So here's an example of pairing that I really base on acidity. Chèvre, which is a style of goat cheese, is perceived to us as being a sort of more acidic cheese. It's a tartar cheese. And it also has a lot of sort of herbaceous or tangy qualities to it. And so Sancerre, which is a Sauvignon Blanc as well, but it's a much drier, much more savory style of Sauvignon Blanc than the one that I was showing with our composed salad, pairs really well with goat cheese because it has the acidity to cut through some of the fat here, but there's a flavor matching of that herbaceousness or earthiness to the cheese. In talking about the warmer and colder regions of the world and acidity, I wanted to point out here, because I find it really interesting thinking about structure in wine, between the 30th and the 50th parallel here, these are the places that the grapes that make most classic wine, Vitis vinifera, are able to grow. There's a couple of exceptions to this, but for the most part, all of the world's famous wine regions are in this small sort of section of the world. Here's some of the places that we know as being famous for growing wine that are all on the 44th parallel. So Eugene, Oregon, where a lot of Pinot Noir is grown. Bordeaux, of course, probably the most famous wine region in the world. Pignoletto DOC, which I'll talk about in a second, which is just an example of one of the places in northern Italy. They're all like the exact 44th parallel. The reason I bring this up is because if we look at a map here with a lot of the famous regions, we know that Bordeaux here is the 44th parallel. So if we're talking about acidity, we can make an assumption that the acid levels in Bordeaux are going to be pretty similar to the acid levels across here, or a little bit higher than the acid levels in the Rhone Valley, which we talked about, a little bit lower than the acid levels in Piemonte, where we have Barolo and Barbaresco. Even though the grapes grown here will also attribute to the acid levels, you can think of a lighter bodied or more acidic wine if you're making a guess coming from something that is north of Bordeaux. So even on this map, we don't even see the Loire Valley where Sancerre is from, or Champagne up here, or Austria and Germany and Switzerland. They all have really elevated amounts of acidity because they are in colder parts of the world. The next aspect of wine pairing I want to talk about is tannin levels and the structure of wine as it applies to tannin. Tannins can be found in the seeds and the stems and the skins of grapes, and they bring a lot to the structure and the flavor of wine. There's really two things that they mostly bring. Tannins also have a lot to do with the aging of wine. So you often see wines that are built to age having more tannin on them. The thing that is most famous about tannins, or most considered, is this drying quality or this astringent quality. And that's very different from what we were talking about before with dry wine and sweet wine. Dryness in a wine has to do with the sugar levels, but the astringency or the tannin level in the wine has to do with how much it dries out your palate when you're tasting it. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but if you think of really heavy red wines as being tannic, not necessarily being dry, it's a good way to separate the two things in your head. So if you're talking about tannins and astringency from a wine pairing perspective, what tannins do is they neutralize fat. And so when you see food that has really high fat levels, when you're talking about hamburgers or really like roasted fatty pieces of meat, things that have a lot of butter, even things that have a lot of olive oil, sometimes they pair really well with tannic wines because those tannins and that fat will neutralize each other, and you'll be able to taste the parts of the meat or the parts of the dish that otherwise would be covered up by the fat more. You'll be able to taste the flavor in the wine that otherwise would be covered up by the tannin more. Here's a good example of a very sort of tannin-forward dish, Barolo, which we just talked about, which is a very light-bodied but very tannic red wine, is often paired with beef stew. because beef stew, coming as a soup, it has a lot of fat in it. It needs something that has tannin to neutralize that fat, just as Barolo needs fat to neutralize the tannin. But it's not a big dish in terms of the way that we eat it. Because it's somewhat a soup. We want a lighter bodied of wine, something that has a little bit more acidity to cut through it sometimes. And so this is a really famous pairing. They also make really wonderful beef and veal stews in Barolo, and so it's become a classic pairing as well. The second aspect of tannins we're going to talk about is the flavor of tannins, or the bitterness of tannins. And if we looked back at the slide before, where we're talking about different aspects of flavor working well together, really bitter wines may still be delicious in a lot of ways, but we're going to want some salt to potentially dissipate that. And we're not going to want to put them with really spicy or really acidic foods. So when you're thinking about tannins or red wines, we want to think both about how drying they are, but also about how bitter they are. Here's a somewhat classic pairing that's really famous in America now. Barbecued brisket is a style of meat that sees a lot of flame on the outside of the meat. And because of that, there's a lot of bitterness that you have in the actual flavor of barbecued brisket. Sometimes that is paired with a very sweet or a very spicy or vinegary sauce. But even though it is a big meaty dish, it calls for a wine that doesn't have a lot of tannin. So Zinfandel is a grape that, even though it gives us this full-bodied, fruit-forward style of red wine, it actually has very little tannin for red wine. Because of that, it is paired with barbecue quite often. Next, we have intensity. And this intensity has to do with sort of all of the different aspects of wine that we've talked about before. There are certain foods that are delicious because they're very delicate. And because of that, we want to pick wines that are delicate as well. So there are certain wines that are made for foods that are easily overwhelmed. If a food has a flavor that you don't want to get outmatched, you want to make sure that the wine you pick won't cover it up. And so there are wines that seem unflavorful, but they're there for a reason. So when you think about really simple white wines, sometimes those are the best wine pairings because they allow the food to be the star of the dish. A good example of this is sushi. Even though we often see sushi paired with sake, people like to drink wine with sushi, but the differences between the different fish in sushi are often not extreme. And because of that, we want the wine to take a back seat. So we often see acidic, but very delicate wines paired with sushi. Finally, I want to talk about overall structure. Every wine has an aspect of sweetness and an aspect of acidity and an aspect of astringency and bitterness and different flavors. So when you're thinking about pairing wine, you do want to follow some of the rules, but you also want to think about what's the driving force behind this food, what's the thing that I want to stick out, and what's the driving force behind the wine. There might be a food and you want the acidity of the wine to be higher than the acidity of the food, but you might not want a wine that is specifically acidic. And so you could find a wine where the driving force behind the wine is that it's wonderfully flavorful, or the driving force behind the wine is that it's a little bit sweet. The acid can still follow the rules, but it's not the thing that you notice most about the wine. The same thing happens with food. If the thing in a dish is the fruitiness, or if there's a beautiful tomato that you want to make sure is highlighted in a salad, if you're really proud of the garlicky nature of the thing that you made, if there's clams in the dish and you want to make sure that they don't clash with something that is too fruity in a wine, it's important to think about the driving factor between the food and the wine, or the driving factor of the food or the wine, and make sure that you make pairings based on what you want to highlight together. So here's a quick cheat sheet because I know that was a lot really quickly. Here are some rules, and if there's one thing I can give you in this lecture, it would probably be this cheat sheet. The wine should always be sweeter, should always be as sweet or sweeter than the food. The wine should always be as acidic or more acidic than the food. Let the available fats in the food dictate how tannic or how astringent the wine should be. So a fattier food should have a more astringent wine. Salty foods can handle more bitter wines, and they can also handle sweeter wines. Sweet wines and salty foods tend to make really good before meal pairings. And so we see often a lot of salt in appetizers. And because of that, off-dry wines work really well before meals often. They also work really well with cheese. Cocktails work nicely for this too. And finally, decide before whether you want the food or the wine to be the star of the pairing, and make sure that you're making an informed decision or a structural decision based on that. Often, a lot of the work in wine and food pairing is done for us based on the history of the wine or the history of the food. When you're pairing wine, the easiest first guess is to look at where the food is from historically, if it's a classic dish, and pair it with a wine that's from that place as well. So as an example here, I'd like to talk about bistecca alla Fiorentina, which is a really wonderful style of steak made in Tuscany. This is a high heat style of cooking. And even though it's done on a porterhouse steak, there's not any fat used in the cooking itself. It's a direct heat style. They do it over a barbecue or over a flame. And so they're not introducing any extra fat into the steak. It's often, or it's always accompanied by a slightly bitter style of Tuscan olive oil and lemon and rosemary. So even though this is a really big fatty piece of steak, the classic pairing for it would be something that can highlight the flavor of the olive oil and the herbs, and also still be acidic enough to be more acidic than the lemon juice on the steak that's going on top. So the classic pairing is Chianti Classico, which is a medium to full-bodied wine, but not a terribly full-bodied wine. Chianti Classico also is a reasonably high acid wine. If you looked, it's not that far below, or not that far south of Bordeaux. It's just below that 44th parallel. And because it's from Italy or the Old World, it has a higher acid level than something comparable from the New World might be. Most importantly, bistecca alla Fiorentina comes from the Chianti region. And so this wine was developed in part for the foods that they were eating there, just because that's how history sort of went. And so to me, it's sort of one of the most classic and easiest pairings you can do. That being said, there are a lot of wines just like Chianti Classico. And so on the left here, I have wines that are made from the same grape, Sangiovese, Brunello di Montalcino, which is a famous, slightly more full-bodied, bigger style of wine, or Rosso di Montalcino, which is a little bit lighter, but from the same town. Chianti Classico Reserva, which is its own style of wine within Chianti Classico. It sees more oak, and so there's more tannin available. A lot of the tannin can come from the oak barrels that you're aging the wine in. Because of that, if you're cooking it with more olive oil, or if it's a especially fatty piece of meat, you might want to use a Chianti Classico Reserva instead of Chianti Classico. Montecuccio, Morellino di Scansano, Vino Nobile di Montepulciano, these are all similar wines. I put these here because I want to show that there isn't a right answer to any of these pairings, though there are a lot of different things to consider. On the right here, we have other medium to full-bodied wines that structurally are not too different from Chianti. So if you are doing a dish that seems similar to bistecca alla Fiorentina, but it has a different type of sauce, ingredients are coming from a different place. What I have here is Right Bank Bordeaux, which is Merlot-driven Bordeaux for the most part. Rioja Reserva, which is a style of wine from Spain. Washington State Cabernet, Napa Valley Merlot, and Saint Joseph, which is similar to the wine that we talked about for the lamb earlier. It's a Syrah, structurally somewhat similar to Chianti. Here's a picture of Chianti. I just like to show pictures of Italy whenever I can. The second pairing I want to talk about is cedar plank salmon. Though, as we said before, often we see people pairing white wine with fish and red wine with meat. Salmon sort of sits in the middle, much like roasted chicken, where there's a good amount of fat to salmon. And so it can handle wine that has a little bit of astringency or tannin to it. And so a lot of people use this as an opportunity to use red wine with fish because they are in a place where people like to drink red wine. So the next I'm going to talk about some examples of pairing wine and why those pairings work, either from a geographical standpoint or from a structural standpoint. So I'm going to talk about cheese fondue as an example of pairing wine here. Pairing wine and cheese and charcuterie boards is one of the most fun moments to pick wines because there's often a lot of different aspects to the cheese or to the dish or the variety of dishes. So it's a moment that you get to open bottles of wine that you're excited about the wine too, because it doesn't have to match every piece. It just has to sort of work holistically with all of it. The reason I use fondue as an example is because the geographic pairing of fondue often leads to the wines that are most famous with it. what I have here, and the reason I put this slide up is because I'm about to zoom in. It's difficult to tell where in the world I'm looking at. So this is a map, a cheese map of France. I absolutely love, if you Google cheese map of France, you can find a place, or a cheese map of the world, you can find a bunch of websites that you can zoom in and it'll show you the cheeses that are made there. And if we zoom in on this red circle, we wind up on this Swiss-French border with some of the cheeses that are most famous for fondue. And I want to put a disclaimer here. I think of fondue as cheese from this part of the world, but I know that there's wonderful fondue made of cheese from all over the place. So if you enjoy other cheeses with fondue, I encourage you to continue to do that. But the famous cheeses here are Comte down here, Gruyere, and Emmentaler. And I want everyone to just quickly notice this town, Pontarlier, because in the next slide, it's almost exactly the same map, but it'll help orient you to where we're talking about there. So Pontarlier is right down here. So we're kind of shifted a tiny bit to the west. And if you look at the wines that are from this area, this is a wine world map rather than a food world map. We've got Vin which is a famous wine from the Jura, which I'll talk about in a second. We've got Chasselas from Switzerland. And then we've got a couple different places in Burgundy. These are all wine styles within Burgundy, and then there's other wine styles within Burgundy. La Tâche being a vineyard that is some of the most expensive wine in the world is made from there. Meursault being the area of Burgundy that makes famously probably the most full-bodied style of white wine in Burgundy. So here's some things to consider about Alpine cheese and the fondue pairings that you'd have with it. These are medium fat content cheeses. And there's lactic acid in them. And so they're not really cheeses that are perceived as being tangy. They're more cheeses that are perceived as being sort of nutty. And remember that cheese fondue is served warm. So we're probably looking for wines that went through some malolactic fermentation because you can flavor match. You can have pairings that are similar flavors together if you have lactic acid in the wine to match the lactic acid in the cheese. Similarly, wine that's served cold to contrast the hot cheese might be a nice a contrast or a way to make the dish a little bit more refreshing. So a white wine in this situation, even if the cheese could handle tannin, might be nice to have a white wine that's served cold. Oxidative or nutty flavors also for flavor matching. And we probably don't want something that's overly fruity because there might be some contrast there between the savoriness of the cheese and the fruitiness of the wine. Similarly, we might want something with a touch of sweetness because fondue can be such a salty dish. So we don't want something that is overly sweet, but something that's not bone dry will probably work. And so, of course, these are some wines that I love to have with fondue, and they all come from right around that same area. Chasselas is a grape that's grown mostly in Switzerland, which I would advise anyone who likes white wine to at some point buy a bottle of Chasselas to try it. It's not a style that is talked about in America very often, but it's really delicious, sort of medium to full-bodied white wine. Chardonnay and Savagnin from the Jura. The Jura is a area in France that makes a very unique style of Chardonnay mostly, and it became really popular in America about 10 or 15 years ago. The wines used to be very inexpensive but hard to find, but because they were this more traditional, slightly higher acid version of Chardonnay that still had the full-bodiedness and the oaky or the nuttiness of what people liked in California Chardonnay a lot, it became really popular. And finally, Meursault, which I talked about, which is a really full-bodied style of white Burgundy being made almost exclusively from Chardonnay as well. I'm talking mostly about pairing based on structure and pairing based on flavor. I also mentioned at the beginning pairing based on occasion. So there's certain occasions that call for specific wines. And in my feeling, that should supersede the other decision makings and pairings. If you like to celebrate with champagne, you should always celebrate with champagne. You shouldn't worry too much about what else you're having at that time. Similarly, if you are celebrating someone's birthday or important milestone, people often like to try or to have wines from those specific vintages, those specific years. Also, drinking wine from a place that you visited with the people that you're with. So if you went on vacation with people and you then are having dinner with them years later, to have wine from the place you went on vacation together is a really fun way to sort of bring back memories. The example here of a situational or an occasional pairing. This is Krug, one of the fanciest, most expensive producers of champagne and caviar. In the fanciest of occasions, people like to have champagne and caviar together. Similar to occasion pairings, I think about sentimental pairings, and these are pairings that the wine and the food might work really well together, but also they may have just been in the same place at the same time when something really great happened. And so having them together again brings back good memories. There's certain pairings that I really love because I have had them so many times. So in a situation where there actually might be a better option from a flavor standpoint or an acidity and sugar standpoint, I still like the idea of having the things that I've had together before. An example here for me is I'm on the road for work a lot, and I really like having sort of cheap Chianti with chicken Parmesan at like diners or other inexpensive restaurants, just because I feel like I've done that a bunch of times and it's fun for me to do it in different parts of the country. Another sentimental pairing that's really famous in the wine industry is people within the wine industry really like to drink a lot of champagne, but don't always want to do it in a really formal setting. And so champagne and fried chicken works really well together because the acidity of the champagne cuts through the fattiness of the chicken quite a bit, but also chicken is not a necessarily fatty meat. It's just the oil around it. And so it can work with white wine a little bit. So if you think of the same really fancy producer, Krug, two of the pairings that I see most with Krug are caviar and fried chicken, two very different styles of pairings. Now that we've discussed different styles of pairings, I just want to bring a couple of the world's classic pairings because we can talk about all of the different reasons they might work now because we've discussed the different reasons people might put them together. Choucroute garnie is a pickled cabbage that's made in Alsace in northern France. And what is different between choucroute garnie and something like sauerkraut is that the cabbage is actually cooked in the wine from Alsace. And so there's a reasonably high amount of acid in that pickled cabbage, but there's also the flavors of the grapes there. And it's usually served with some type of sausage or herbs, or in this case, potatoes, and then mustard. So there's some bitterness as well. So the famous pairing for choucroute garnie is Alsatian Riesling. Alsatian Riesling is a much more delicate and mostly dry. They can be a touch sweet, but mostly dry style of Riesling. I wanted to use this as an example as a famous pairing because it's not a food or a wine that sees a lot of attention in America, even though it is a style of food that people in America seem to really like. We love hot dogs and sauerkraut. Not too different in terms of the style of food as choucroute garnie, though not nearly as fancy. But also the pairing here takes into account a lot of the things that we talked about today. The wine is actually used in cooking the food. And so there's a flavor matching of similar flavors in the food and the wine that is going to be there no matter what. That being said, the food is not particularly flavorful. It's a very delicate style of food. Because of that, you need to have a delicate wine that won't overwhelm it. So the intensity matches there as well. Finally, there's a touch of sweetness in the food, but there's a lot of acidity in the food. And so you need to make sure that there's a wine that isn't bone dry, but has a very elevated amount of acidity. And Alsatian Riesling certainly fills that void. A side note here, German Riesling, a lot of the Riesling that is more popular in America can be very, very acidic and really good for pairings like this. There's also a lot of different sweetness levels to German Riesling. So if you're talking about German Riesling as a pairing, which I know I've mentioned a couple times, it's important when you're buying the wine to ask, is this a dry wine or an off-dry wine? One of the world's most famous pairings is blue cheese and port, specifically Stilton blue cheese. And this is an example to me of a +2. Not that that's something you always want to go for, but I never really liked blue cheese. And frankly, I never really liked port until someone made me sit down and have them together. And it was such a wonderful experience for me that now I really love blue cheese and I love port on their own. This works for a bunch of different reasons. The acidity of the port is able to cut through a lot of the fat content of the blue cheese. But port doesn't taste like a necessarily really acidic wine. So it's not something that's too tart tasting, but it is elevated enough that they can match. The cheese also is somewhat acidic because it's lactic acid. So a less acidic style of wine may not be able to carry through. Similarly, you wouldn't think of blue cheese and a sweet thing together necessarily, but the gaminess or the blueness of the cheese gets a little bit dissipated by the sweetness of the wine. And so you end up tasting the grapiness or the intricacies of the wine more rather than just the sweetness. And you end up tasting the creaminess and sort of the beauty of the blue cheese more rather than just the blueness. And so this is one of the pairings that I think it's also reasonably easy to find port and reasonably easy to find good blue cheese. If you are thinking about food and wine pairings right now, this is a really good one to go out and do. Oyster wines. So pairing wine and oysters is another one of the most popular wine and cheese pairing or wine and food pairings because a lot of the places that serve oysters also are sort of hubs of the wine industry. However, they are not often places that wines are grown. And so there are not very many local pairings for wine and oysters. It's more about what wine from around the world makes sense here. What's important about oyster wines, first of all, is you don't want something that's going to overwhelm the oysters. And because oysters are served with a lot of different acidic sauces or things that you put on them, and they're also very salty, you have to think about wines that can handle a lot of salt and a lot of acidity without being overwhelming. Here's some of the most famous shellfish wines from around the world. Chablis, which is the most acidic and sort of lightest style of white Burgundy. So if you think of Meursault as the nuttiest and heaviest, Chablis is the brightest. Sparkling wine and oysters are very popular together. So champagne, of course, but other very dry sparkling wines like Cava from Spain or American sparkling wine, usually from the Pacific Northwest or from Napa Valley or Sonoma. And then Sekt, which is a really traditional style of sparkling wine made in Germany. It's often made out of Riesling, but it's a very dry style of Riesling. One of the sort of lesser known wines that I really love with oysters is called Erologie Blanc. It is a Basque wine. So it's from the border between France and Spain. There's also really famous wines on the Spanish side of the Basque called Chacolí. And those are wines that are often used with shellfish. There's a lot of shellfish served in Spain. So those wines were developed to be with shellfish to some extent. Austrian white wine is very acidic and often very delicate. And it's usually very, very fairly priced. There's a grape in Austria called Grüner Veltliner, which if I am not sure what different people are going to order or I don't want to be spending a lot of money in a restaurant, Grüner Veltliner is sort of one of the safest and most exciting, inexpensive wines to be buying right now. The quality there is so good and it's such an easy pairing, though very, very dry. And finally, Muscadet, which is a wine from the Loire Valley in France. It's from an area called Nantes. And it is a easy to drink, also very delicate, very dry wine made out of a grape that is really only grown there called Melon de Bourgogne, which confusingly is not from, the grape is from Burgundy, but they don't grow it there anymore. Muscadet is another wine that is inexpensive and really consistent. It's a really good white table wine if you're going to be having a variety of different things in the meal. What I would warn is not to confuse Muscadet with an ET at the end with Muscat or Muscadel or Moscato, because they are all a different type of wine that is often very fruity and sweet and would not go well with oysters. Here's some pictures of those bottles just to give people a little bit of eye memory. On the left here, we have Chablis, one of my favorite producers, Moreau Nadet. Second from the left here, we have Erimina, which is Erologie, which is the wine from the Basque region. We have one of my favorite producers of Grüner Veltliner, Gobelsberg. They also make a beautiful rosé every year, which is pretty easy to find. It's a great wine if you're like going to sit in the park or something like that. And finally, we have Muscadet all the way on the right. So I want to talk for a second about how to pair wine at restaurants, because at a restaurant, you're not going to know necessarily as much about the food that's coming out as something that you are serving yourself. And because it's not your wine, you might not know that as much about the bottles. Fine dining restaurants often employ people to help make wine pairings, to make the experience more enjoyable or more special. And so the best way to order wine at a restaurant, in my opinion, is to look over the wine list and the menu yourself, but then ask really clear and objective questions to someone who knows the wine and knows the food. I think there's this misnomer that sommeliers are going to try to convince you to spend more money than you wanted to, but it's really the opposite. Their job is hoping or helping you have the best time that you can at the restaurant. So to ask really pointed questions to say, I like wines with a lot of tannin. I'd like to spend this much money, and me and the people that I'm here with are all ordering meat. Sommelier will be able to point you to a wine that you might not otherwise have chosen that might match really well with that dish based on the objective guidelines that you gave them. Pairing wines at home is a little bit different because we're limited to the bottles that we own, but also we are able to adjust the food a little bit if we're really excited about the wine. And we might know more about the wine because we may have had it before or had it recently, or it might already be open. When you're pairing wine at home, I think it's important to think about the regions that you're buying the wines from and not necessarily the wineries. When you're tasting wine in a vacuum, when you're only having one glass of wine, it's hard to compare it from a structural standpoint, the acidity and the sugar, the tannin, to all the other wines you might have had. But if you think about the regions that match the food that you are serving and pick that way from the wines that you have in your house, you often will get to something that makes more sense than trying to remember the wine specifically yourself. Though the grape is really important, if you think about where in the world it is from, that will often lead you to a better wine pairing than just which grape it is. If you know what region you are looking for and what grape you're looking for, so Alsatian Riesling, for instance, if you say that in a wine shop to help build your collection at home, they will absolutely be able to find something that matches what you're looking for. Those two pieces of information when you're buying wine for the house are the most important, is where should it be from and what grape is it? I've learned that when I am collecting wine to open, so not collecting in a investment way, but collecting wine to pair with food at home, it's always good to buy 2 bottles of wine that you're excited about, because you're going to know so much more about it. You're going to be able to make a more informed decision the second bottle that you open. And so if you are excited about a bottle, if you're recommended a bottle from a wine shop and it's not something that's too expensive, it's good to get 2 and open one and try it so that you have a more informed decision to make the second time. Finally, ask a lot of questions. In some other lectures that I've given, I've encouraged people to, if they're interested in wine, form a relationship with a local wine store. People that work at that store are there to help you enjoy the wine that they're selling, though you sometimes might be able to find a better deal online. If you have a good relationship with someone who works in a store, you can go back and say, I liked this for this reasons. I didn't like this for these reasons. Someone is going to learn your taste. Your taste might not match up with the ratings that you see on the internet and magazines, but wine is not so much, it's not hierarchical. It's not about the best wine. It's about the right wine. And having someone who's a professional learn with you about what you like can help with wine pairing a lot and help have the wines that you feel really good about opening in your house. So here's a picture of me from a couple years ago in a pork store. And I figured I would list a few of my favorite modern pairings in case anyone wanted to try them at home, but also sort of maybe just to get myself hungry. The first is a good baguette and good butter and champagne. I taught a champagne class a couple weeks ago here, and often people think about champagne from a pairing sense or a situational sense as something being really fancy. But really good bread is often overlooked for just how delicious it is itself. It doesn't necessarily need other fancy things with it. And same thing with really good butter. And so I have found I enjoy good bread with good butter with champagne about as much as any of the fancy champagne pairings I could have. It makes me feel better about opening a fancy bottle of wine from having something that's less fancy with it at home. The second, I more and more have started cooking vegetarian at home. I myself am not a vegetarian, but I have more friends that have stopped eating meat or like to eat less meat. And when making vegetarian food, but not vegan food, using cheese in the food will allow you to have that, to some extent, meatiness, but really fat content that still makes it go with red wine. I have found that veggie burgers, specifically Impossible Burgers or Beyond Burgers at home with smoked mozzarella on them, so they taste really meaty, go really well with Napa Cabernet. So that's a new sort of favorite modern pairing of mine. Finally, though not really a modern pairing, Epoisses, which is a sort of stinky soft cheese, and Madeira. I like to bring this up because Madeira is the style of wine that stays good for the longest, essentially forever, even after it's opened. So it's a really nice pairing to have at your house if you're someone who doesn't drink a lot, but you do want to have something special to bring out. If you buy a bottle of Madeira and you open it, it doesn't matter. As long as you put the cork back in, it will last as long as you want it to and not change in flavor very much. Epois is a style of cheese that's really beautiful in a presentation. It comes and it doesn't seem that soft when you buy it and it's cold, but if you leave it out for a few hours, it gets extremely runny. So you can put it in a bowl and have the Madeira next to it. And the minute you cut into it, it's almost like a spoon and put it on bread with the Madeira. It's an easy and very elegant pairing to do at home.